is actually going to be kind of repeat, but we're going to approach it a different way. So hopefully it has enough interest or has enough variety to pique everybody's interest a little bit. So my name is Daniel Hoescht. I'm the director of CRM systems at Instructure. And that means I run Salesforce for Instructure with a small team of admins, and I'm currently the only developer, so it's a little challenging times, but we have a good time. So if you have kids that are taking virtual class, you're probably using our product Canvas, so it is super busy right now for us. So it's been kind of interesting, but also pretty darn crazy. So, all right. So let's talk about the different types, and I'm going to focus really on record triggered automation. I know Mira got into a lot of more details around some of the batch, other things. I'm going to focus mostly on the record triggered stuff for now. And I shamelessly stole this from the Salesforce, from a document that I'm going to share with everybody that Salesforce put out. And these are their recommendations right now for automation with a record triggered update, with record triggered automation. So they have it from, they call it low code to pro code. So trigger before save or flows are definitely code. They may be drag and drop, but you are still using coding logic. And
hey, sorry to interrupt. You're not sharing your screen.
Oh, sorry. Let me do that. I thought I did. I'm so used to Zoom, I can't work in anything else. All right, there you go. Now you good? Not that none of the other slides are super important. There you go. That's where we are. We're on the good stuff now. So yeah, this document here, this is, like I said, cribbed from a document. So we've got low code here, all the way to pro code. And so like I was mentioning, flow is definitely still code. You are putting in branching logic, with decisions. You can have loops. So you are coding. It may just not be with you typing it out. So, and these are Salesforce's current recommendations, and well, not just the recommendations, but what you can do with each of these types of automation. So, starting at the low code side, the before save flow triggers. Those are great for and can be used for the same record field updates. So these are the workflow rules that are updating the same record, or even process builder. And then they are also great for batch processing because they are in that before save context. We haven't written to the database yet, and so you don't get that overhead of the database writes. But then you can't do any of these other things. So if you have a before save flow, you can't do cross object CRUD. So you can't update, like if you have it fire on an opportunity, you can't have it update the account, for example, if you wanted to. So we'll have to move into an after save context for something like that. And then, flow doesn't let you do some of these other things. Like you can't do complex list processing, can't do the async types of processing, and you can't add validation errors. So like if you can't get through, so if you needed to do some really complicated validation and add an error to the record, you got to jump all the way to code for that. So so these are some of the areas. So after save flow gives us that cross-object CRUD. Now you'll notice they're saying that same record field updates are not ideal. That's because you should be setting the value on the field before it's saved, not after it's saved. Because if you do it after the save, then you're going to force another save to the database, and you're going to add some overhead. Same reason. So sometimes you may need to have your after save flow, which calls an apex, an invocable action. And in that case, then what you can start to do is do some more complex list processing. You can do some async processing, and add a little bit. And then you get everything when you jump into triggers. So all of that stuff is all available. So this is sort of the context of what we're going to talk about and how some of this stuff works here. But like you'll notice, two things are not on this list. Workflow rules. They have been around forever, and And there's a couple of unique things I just wanted to highlight with workflow rules. One is they're unique in that they're the only type of record triggered automation that doesn't fire validation rules when you update fields. So in the past, we've used workflow rules to slide in behind those validation rules and go ahead and do an update that would be prevented in any of the other contexts. Whether that's good or bad is up for debate. It does add some nasty messages when you hit them in Process Builder, but I know those messages are getting in. They're improving a bit. The other thing, we have we're still old school, but outbound messages it's a pretty quick way to get a message sent out to some external system. So you don't have to write any code, and outbound messages have some pretty good error handling in them. I wish they would come up with a replacement for outbound messages that we can use in Process Builder, or Flow, because you could build your own, but it's going to be a lot of code. One kind of fun thing with workflow rules and Process Builder was sometimes, like if you are sending an email from a workflow rule and you're referencing like a lookup to a user, and that lookup is optional, but you want to use it as the recipient. If you're using that in a workflow rule, then it will actually just quietly not send the email message. If you try to do that same thing in a Process Builder, your whole thing comes to a screeching halt and fails. So that's again kind of a nice thing about workflow rules with their email recipients, with emails. And then my question here is, will they go the way of S controls, right? Like I'm kind of, if I'm not a betting man, but if I were to bet, I would say that at some point, I don't know when, that they might disable the ability to create new workflow rules. And if you have them, then you can modify them, but you won't be able to create new ones. I don't think, just even now, S controls are still available. You can create them, or you can edit, you can have them, but you can't create new ones. So I'm kind of wondering if the same thing's going to happen. I have no inside knowledge. That's just my guess. So Process Builder is also not on that list. And the big thing, and Mira kind of highlighted it, and this is one of the reasons why it's slower than everything else, is that it's always an after save context. So when you have a Process Builder fire a same record update, it's gonna write that record back to the database. So it's always gonna have more overhead. But it also, it and workflow rules both support is changed, is new, and prior value. Flow does not do that right now. There are some workarounds, and I'll talk a little bit about how you can do is changed and is new with some workarounds. But those are not available in Flow right now. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to highlight Process Builder as a reason. Is a reason why you might want to keep it. And then scheduled actions, right? So Process Builder has the mechanism for you to schedule to do something in the future that, and workflow does too, but Flow has, you can do a pause, but you can't actually just do that fire and forget and not worry about it anymore. So Eric, you can do wait elements, but it's not quite the same because it's hacky. So we'll move on. All right. So again, we have a scenario just like Mira did here. Mine's super dumb, but what I did, because I just wanted to use standard fields that are available without having to create some, and I didn't want to think too hard. So basically mine said, if we set the account rating to be hot, then we're going to just update the number of employee field to be 100. If we set it to warm, we're going to set it to 200 and cold to 300. So it's just, it makes no business sense, but it's just a way for us to update a couple things. So that's what we're going to implement here. So for my testing, I wanted to do this because there's a lot of variation between when you do a single record save. It can vary a lot. Like you have to insert a lot of records. So I'm just going to try it with some bulk operations and play around with things. So what I did was I'm going to drop in 200 accounts at a time. There's 4 different ratings if you count null as a rating, and I'm going to interleave them. So you can see here, instead of grouping them, and this is actually important in Process Builder because of how Process Builder works. If I were to have grouped all the hots together, whoops, I went forward. If I were to group all the hots together and the warms together and the colds together, it would actually have different characteristics. It would process it differently, which I found really interesting. So, so this will actually kind of cause Process Builder to hit more DML stuff that we'll see. All right. So what's going on here with this is, instead of, and Mira showed that you can use the dev console to check your log levels, to get your CPU times and some other things. But those actually have a pretty big impact on your CPU time. It can, if you just look at some of the snapshots, your CPU time can be reported high, because every time you do a console, a system, can you tell I've been JavaScript a bit, console.log, so system.debug, then you are actually using some CPU time. So I did an example here where I ran some example code, and if I had dev console open with its normal log levels, just the standard log levels, then you can see that if I had debug, so let's see here. So these top 2 are your debug. And so I did one where I was writing, so I was doing a system.debug. So here's the code you can see here, but basically I have a list of 1,000, it's 1,000, and it just repeats the letter A 1,000 times in each of those lists. And then I'm outputting that into the debug log when this runs. And so when I do this, if I have this system.debug in here, then it took it 9 seconds of CPU time to do that. It was basically, I did this thing. So it ran through this list of 1,000 strings 100 times. So this did it. So I ran this 100,000 times. It wrote 100,000 system.debugs out, and it took 9 seconds to do that. If I did the same thing without logging, it only took 3 seconds. And then if I don't have the debug statements or the system.debug, if I just had commented that out, if I run it with dev console on, I get 4.5 seconds of CPU time, and without it, it runs it in 300 milliseconds. So it can impact your CPU time. I know there are ways where you can look at more specific things to get into it, but it does impact. It can impact not only, and Anthony commented on this in the chat, it can actually impact how Apex behaves. And there's a super unique bug that is happening with flow and CPU time. CPU time is not reported correctly if you're debugging it, unless you hit Apex afterwards. So if you ran something that was just all flow, it would tell you no CPU ran. But as soon as you would call some Apex, it would then spike your CPU, because then it would measure it at that point. So that's something I heard they're going to be fixing in winter. So what I wanted to do was, let's do this without, and you're wondering well, how did I get this? Because, how can I get my CPU time without logging? Well, I used an open source package that lets us do that. And you can actually incorporate this into your code. Eric, I know you were asking about well, how can I tell when one thing starts and one thing ends? You could potentially put this code into in your code. You could actually be taking snapshots as you go and capture. You'd be okay, here's what my CPU time was during up to this point, and then you could run it again later and say, okay, what is it at the end? So if you've got some Apex, I guess you could even make this an invocable action and potentially call it from call it from there. And yeah, I wouldn't put this into production, even this kind of code I guess you could put it in production and have some like controls to be able to turn it on or off. But I wouldn't do this in normal times because it's right. We can write it to a database. So even itself, you would be doing your recommendations there. So this, let's talk a little bit about this. So the limits profiler is the app. I've got a link here. We can share it. I'll talk a little bit more about how it works. Actually, why don't we jump? Oh, yeah. So let me just show you. This is like the example that I was doing before, where you can put in your profiler type, and my profiler type is this. So here's my profiler. And what we have is we have our profile, which when we create an instance of this thing, we can basically set up our list to use it. And then, so we don't use any CPU on the setup portion. And then I guess I was working, yeah, it was this one. So here we're creating our list, and so we don't actually use any CPU that is being used like to set up our testing. And then we only are testing our CPU for anything inside this execute method. So this lets us really isolate the thing that we're looking to test rather than like looking at the entire transaction. So you can, in this case, like this example is saying, hey, let's test this, how does the JSON serialize method? How much CPU does that take? So you can actually test different things, inside of Salesforce. So you could test, built-in methods, or you could test your own code and like see what happens in those. So basically, we're just going to call that. We're going to call that method, and so then I can check different, like, what do I want to display when I capture? So when I run this, this is, you can see my iterations. I'm going to just back this off to 1, so it just runs really fast. And we'll measure. So what this does is actually runs that code and tells you how how quickly it ran. So this ran like 2 milliseconds. So basically that ran nothing. But what's cool is that I can save this to the database, and then I can run reports on it. So we will come back to this here and see some results. So just like Mira, I have some different solutions. So I'm going to run, again, we have a workflow rule. I did 3 workflow rules based on if it's a hot account, a cold account, or a warm account to set the employee count. I did a process builder with, let me go into present so you can actually see that better. Process builder with 3 nodes that just checks if it's a hot account, it does an update, a warm account, an update, cold account, an update, right? We did a trigger, which just switches on that rating and sets the number of employees. And a before save flow that checks that has a decision and then calls to these different assignments. So just, basically 4 different ways to do the same thing in these different automation tools. All right, so I'm just going to show you the results. And here is what happened. So I'll just start at the top with Apex. And and so here you can see my Apex trigger took 600 milliseconds. We had 200 rows impacted because that's how many I inserted, with 1 DML statement because this was a before insert. So we didn't have to query anything. So none of those got updated. I guess I should have talked about baseline. So baseline was no automation at all. It took it 500 milliseconds to just run an insert with no automation at all on it. So Apex added it's barely that, in this case, it barely added anything. Then you can see the before save flow was a little bit above Apex, but I mean, that's within margin of error, really. It's pretty darn close. And again, It's a before save, so it just is doing 200 records and one DML because it's just inserting them all at the same time. Now here's where things get funky and kind of crazy. Process Builder hits us at 1.5 seconds of time and 350 rows with 4 DML statements and 3 queries. When I saw this, I was like, what? And I actually I got on a call with one of the architects over at Salesforce who's building Flow, and this was kind of before save, and I was like, what is going on? And he didn't even really know. So I mean, under the covers, Process Builder is Flow, but the way it implements things is really, really odd. So what I found was that anytime you are doing an update, let me go back to that Process Builder real quick. So on this, you'll notice, so we have an update, right? And so for each of these updates, because these are buried under each of these nodes, we have 3 updates. And since I am inserting enough records to cause the what am I trying to say? To do the update, when this is firing, it actually appears to be doing a query before it does the update. Like it's checking the record to make sure nothing's changed on it before it does an update, I think. And so because we have 3 updates, that's where our 3 DMLs came from. Or sorry, 4 DMLs, because the first DML was the insert, and then 3 more DMLs for the updates. And then you can see the average number of DML, or the DML rows that got inserted, was 350. So 200 for the initial insert, and then 50 for each of the hot, warm, and cold. So so that's why we have 350. There was some that were null, so those didn't get an update. And so we had that's what happened basically. So you can see that it ran 3 queries, 1 for each update, and then it queried those 150 records before it updated them. So lot of overhead going on in this Process Builder, and a big reason why we're seeing problems when people are migrating their workflow rules over to Process Builder. This is the kind of stuff that can happen. So I wish that Salesforce came out and pushed Process Builder really hard, and I think they made a mistake. So and then let's look at old school workflow rules. I think Anthony in the chat, we were talking about this. So in this case, workflow rule took longer than our before save and our Apex. So same overhead in terms of, it's not adding any overhead in your DML and your rows and your statements, not adding any queries, but it did take longer than my Apex and my before save flow. So so kind of interesting. Now, according to Salesforce, it's very expensive to the initialization steps that are for both Process Builder and Workflow Rule are much more expensive than Apex and before save. So I think that's part of what explains this. So so that's what happens. So according to this, we need to be looking at Apex and before save flows in this particular use case of a same record field update. So let's see. So like I said, so when possible, that before save is much more efficient because you don't incur that overhead of the CPU of inserting the CPU. You have the insert, you have to fire everything all over again, and it's a mess. Like I said, Process Builder seems to requery the record before it does an update, and it doesn't bulkify the updates. Like it split those. So it didn't take those 3 nodes that had an update and put them all into a single update at the end, where it could have just said, oh, okay, you've got 150 records that need updating. Let's do one single update. It's actually separating those into 3 updates for each of the nodes. So the more nodes and the more updates you have on your Process Builder, the more overhead you're going to incur on those as well. So if you had a Process Builder that had, one node and it had a field update, then it said evaluate the next criteria, and you kept going, and your record had multiple hit multiple of those nodes, you would get all kinds of updates going on, even with a single record. So yeah, so watch out for that. So now let's jump into some of the so this Architect's Guide to Record Trigger Flows, which I mentioned. So I've got a link here, and I've also got a link at the end of the presentation. I've also got it up so we can look at it together. So this is according to Salesforce. This is what they're saying. So they say don't put your same record field updates into workflow rules in Process Builder. So put them into your before save flow triggers instead, or Apex. I'll add or Apex because Apex triggers before save Apex can give you the same benefits. Let's see. What are we doing here? So then they also recommend that you use your after save flow triggers rather than Process Builder workflow, except for the same record, which you want to go up to here. So, and then if you have high performance needs with especially sophisticated logic, use your Apex. So these are their recommendations for workflow rules. Sorry, not workflow rules, for record triggered flows, and workflow rules don't really fall into that. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that Flow does not have and why you might need to still fall back to Process Builder or workflow rules right now. So Process Builder will, so Flow is never going to implement the allow recursive executions feature, which is probably a good thing. If you need, I think, the main reason to implement a recursive execution is if you need to fire, like you have two different automations, and you don't know the order of execution, right? So you can't control the order of execution of which process is going to fire first. And so if you needed to make sure that, process 1 is going to update a field, when that field update happens, we want process 2 to pick it up. That would be where you might use recursive. In those cases, just put it in a flow and just put them in order, right? Like you can order your flow to say, I need this thing to happen first and then the other thing to happen. So that would be my recommendations for the use case of recursive executions. So they are not going to implement it because it adds overhead, right? If you are causing loops to happen to recurse, then it's going to cause some problems. This is coming in winter, so in my org, it's happening tomorrow, where we'll now be able to get this option. There's a radio button that says you can only execute that, only follow that decision path if the record has changed. So this is awesome. I'm really looking forward to this. Is changed is not available, like I mentioned earlier yet, and they're talking that'll be within about a year. So probably maybe by the winter 22 release. I'm not sure. So is changed, prior value, and is new are all like functions that we use a lot. Now let me talk a little bit. I mentioned that that there are some workarounds. So is new, the workaround is actually really easy. You can just check your record's ID. If your record has no ID, it's new. So that's a pretty simple one to do. Is changed gets harder, but if you're in a before save context, like you do a before save flow, you can actually query that record and get the existing values because it hasn't been written to the database yet. So if you do a get record at the beginning of your before save flow to get the record that entered the flow, then you can get so basically you can get the prior value, which you can then use to check the is changed. So you can do some comparisons here to see what's changed. So you can work around these, but I think these will just make things a lot easier. So scheduled actions, they're saying in about a year. So this would be that different than that wait element. This is actually, putting something into. So where you can fire it, instead of like having a wait element and then saying, like trying to figure out how long from now to fire it, like, a scheduled action I'm picturing to be more like workflow rule or process builder, where you can say, oh, I want to fire this on a date that's on the record. And if that date on the record changes, then also when the scheduled action would change, rather than, if you have a wait, like it doesn't react to record changes. So scheduled changes is still a reason to use process builder or workflow rule. Oops, did I go back? All right. Access global variables. This is more of a pain point, but you have to, like with flow, you have to create a formula to access anything that you might need to work in your flow. And then this is coming in this release. So we'll be able to get parent records in our flows without having to query the parent record. So that'll make our flows even more performant if we don't have to do a query. So super exciting to see that. And then being able to call, and this is again in a before save context, so to call another flow. We can't do that right now in our before save flows, but they're talking about a year to happen. So yeah, and I don't know, Jake, I don't know what the implications are going to be to CPU time, but they really do seem to be sincere about making sure they build all this stuff right this time. I've seen some pretty cool stuff. So workflow rules, they're never planning on getting the same, to coming to parity with workflow rules to allow you to not trigger a validation rule. Like they're just saying, nope, that is just a weird behavior. You shouldn't do that. And you'll need to do other things to get around validation rules if you need to. So they're never implementing that. Interestingly, they're actually, I don't know if they're actually going to do in outbound messages or if they're going to do something like, what's the word I'm looking for? I think Jake, you had mentioned them, the external, what are they called? I'm totally blanking. External services. Thank you. Yeah. So external service. I don't know if this will be external services or if it will be actually like the outbound messages that we have with workflow rule. So and then checking, like monitoring to see when things are so what's queued and that kind of stuff. So that looks like they're planning on having that come probably along with their scheduled actions. So. Let's see. All right. I'm not sure, Anthony, you said Apex before triggers do it too. Was that do what? I can answer that question or try to answer it. Oh, validation rules. Yes. Yeah. Apex triggers do hit validation. Like if you hit a validation rule on a trigger, it will stop your trigger. So, all right. Yeah, we can pause. Let's pause and do. Yeah, so we talked about the weight elements. I don't know. We could play around. We could probably play around with the workflow cost for single records. I'm not sure. I think it gets more where you then start piling on multiple workflow rules is where I think that those costs, those initialization costs, start adding up. I'm not familiar with the new continue to process node. So is it new or are you jump to here? Yeah. So that's what I was thinking. I think if you were evaluating like on your, and I may have got it here, this process that's part of my demo has that feature, So I've got the value of the next criteria, and that's so it basically had, this is a hot account, and then set all those for update. This is a warm account, set all those for update. So I don't have an example of right here of if the same record met both of these criteria, what would happen to your DML in those cases? But in bulk situations, these things are nasty. So, all right, I think I'm going to move on. While I'm here, so we can also talk a little bit about what happens, when you save a record. This thing I used to kind of have memorized, and they've added so many different things to it now. I always have to go back and look. So this is basically what happens when you save a record. And so early, you can see that record triggered flows and before triggers are going to fire there. So this is before it's running any validation rules or anything like that. So that's really early in the process. And then what actually is kind of cool is that both of these are running before your duplicate rules. And in the past, if you had a workflow field update that could cause a record to become a duplicate, it was not getting caught by the duplicate rules. So now, if we have these before, I'm hoping that they can be flagged as a duplicate before the save happens. So. Kind of cool there. And then it is then going to save it, but doesn't commit it yet. And then they're going to fire all those after triggers. Going to do your, we've got, and then finally, here's workflow rules. So workflow rules are running way late in this process. So it's after all the other things happen, then our workflow rules happen. But then this is where so then the record gets updated. So if you have a field update, it's got the updating the record again. It's going to send you back to the beginning and start all over. So because it's not really going to send you back, but it is going to fire your update triggers and your after update triggers one more time. But your validation rules don't run. So there are some kind of odd things here like you get your update triggers, but you don't get your flows. So there are some interesting things happening there. Then our processes fire, then our flows. So yeah, so all of these are running, and then finally we get our after record flows, and I think that's about it. So you can see it. Where these things are sitting is a little bit. They're much earlier and much later in the process than like flows and process builders. So when a flow calls another flow, so I mean those would be in this step here. So the flow is going to be launched by a process. So basically you've got your processes, but we don't know what order happens here. So they don't say they're guaranteed. So I have no idea what happens on those. So always good to refer to that and see what's going on. Okay, getting here. All right. Another interesting thing that they discuss in the automation guide is that if you're doing scheduled action, they say to use workflow rules, which was kind of boggled my mind. They're like, don't use process builder, use a workflow rule if it's possible. And I think that's because the scheduling mechanism, like behind the scenes for workflow, is more robust than the process builder one. And I'll tell you, for me, the biggest gotcha with process builder when it comes to scheduling an action is if you schedule actions far in the future and you have some turnover in your company, then any scheduled actions that are triggered by an inactive user at the time that the action fires, they fail. And it actually has caused us a lot of problems. So for example, like we have CPQ, and when a contract is created, we wanted to do some things like fire an automation. Just excuse me. We wanted to say when the contract gets close to its expiration date, then create the renewal automatically. But if we did that in Process Builder, we had inactive users trying to fire those things and they were failing. So we didn't have renewals getting created, and it was a huge mess. So we actually switched that particular one to batch Apex to run, because it so every night it runs batch Apex to look for any contracts that need renewals created, and then starts the process from there, because it just had some overhead. So like I mentioned, Process Builder has those problems with inactive users. So you can use scheduled flows. So if you don't need it to happen, if you just need it to happen, say at some point, you could do a scheduled flow, right? So you can have your flow run on some schedule and just pick up any records that need to be updated and save it. So that's nice. One issue though with scheduled flow is you can't control the batch size. It's always going to be so if you have a lot of records, your batch size is going to be 200. And if you have a lot of automation going on in your org, like if it's like my org, may not handle 200 records at a time very easily, and it fails. So I could not use scheduled flow with contracts because the overhead of CPQ is too high. Basically, CPQ just can't handle, if you mark 200 records at a time to create the renewal opportunity, it just will choke because it just can't handle it. So I could not use scheduled flow. So that's why I used this batch Apex and set my batch size to 1. So it just runs through and does 1 record at a time. So yeah. So that's kind of what you do there. And that's pretty much all I had. I can do this. So this is the link to the automation, the Salesforce automation, and this is my link to I actually created a GitHub repo with these scenarios that you can install. So let me jump over to that since we have a few minutes. If I can find it. Here we go. So here is the, actually before I get to my repo, this is the limits profiler one. And I have this limit snapshot pulled up, this particular class, because this is that class you could put into your own code to grab snapshots. Basically, what it does is it is going to get all the different limits that are possible. And then you basically run this snapshot twice, and then it does a diff to tell you the difference between when you said start and end. And then you can record that into a custom object that comes in that particular one that you can then do reporting on. So in this case, let's go find it. So it can grab a particular record, and you can get to see, it'll write all of the different features about it. So we can see elapsed time, CPU time. These didn't have any queries, so everything's 0. But you can use that. And and then here's my repo that I created, and in here, basically it has the classes, so it has the profilers that you could use to try doing some inserts, and it also has the trigger. So I've got my triggers in here. I did not best practice, and I just threw it all. I didn't use a handler. I just put it in the trigger because it was a simple one. So and then it also has your flows. So process builder, your process builder and your flows are in here too. So you can play around with those if you'd like to see what happens. So, all right, that's all I've got. Any questions?
I think you addressed all the questions except for, I don't know if you even want to touch on this. What is the use case for recursive execution?
Oh yeah, I kind of did. I think so. Like if you have a field update that is doing, like if you have one process that updates a field and then another process might rely on that field update to like say, oh, should I also do this? Then you would have to have recursive. But like I said, in a flow, I would just put my flow. I'd say, well, do this thing first, and then then I can use that criteria later on in my flow. So, and my team has spent a lot of time talking about how do we architect, like how do we design our flows like build them so that they're maintainable and also like just easy to understand. And one of the nicest thing about flows compared to or one of the nicest things is that flows give you the ability to have list views. So we can create list views of our flows instead of having that nasty process builder UI where you have to, every time you open it and close one, you have to go back and you can't have any deep links to send you to a particular flow. We can create list views to say, these are all my account record update flows. And then that way you can keep them all. So we are doing it in terms of kind of by functionality. So we're saying, okay, this is my flow that's going to be setting what's a forecast category or something like that, right? So I have a forecast category flow for my opportunity. And then I might have another one that is something to do with calculating some financial numbers about the opportunity. Those two flows don't really, like neither of them are dependent on the other, so we're keeping them separate. But you do have to watch out if you separate them. If you have multiple Git records, then if you're trying to go get a parent record or some other record in multiple of those, and you might start running into some SOQL limits because each of those is going to be separate SOQL. So you might have, I'm hoping they will do the ability, well, I guess it's in a year, to where you could have more of like a dispatcher type of a flow. Like, so you could have a single flow that would be like, okay, everything comes in, we want to get a couple of key records, and then I want to call out to like, oh, now I want to call out to this flow that does this thing, this flow that does this thing, this flow that does this thing. So that's where I'd like to see that as architecture in the future. But for now, we're just splitting our flows into separate ones. And I guess, and Anthony, asked the question. The other reason why I like to split them is because is for source control and kind of deploying. So if you have a giant flow that does everything, then your testing is a lot more complicated. You got to make sure that you didn't break any of the existing stuff. If you're deploying a flow that does all of your automation versus deploying individual bite-sized flows. So I prefer to do the bite-sized ones just because they're easier to test and you're a little more comfortable that you're not deploying something that could break your org. Source control. The biggest problem I have with source control with flow is that the flow contains the positions on the canvas. And so if you're just like, you go and add a single, maybe you just add a single element to your flow, your existing flow, but then you're like, oh, it's not pretty enough. I want to move things around. Then you look at the diff and everything's changed because everything's been moved around. So it's really hard to eyeball it to say, what did my dev actually change? Because I can't tell. Maybe the auto layout will help. I haven't looked at what an auto layout flow looks like in source control, but maybe if you use those, then it won't have all the positions. So that's probably my biggest gotcha with source control is those positions are adding some weird things. I also did run into a problem where I had built this package I guess 15 months ago. And I could not deploy a flow. One of the flows would not deploy because the version changed. They had changed so many things on the before save flows that it just would not let me deploy the before save flow anymore. And I had to rebuild it. I just could not get it to deploy. So there could be some problem, like since they are changing so many things, that maybe some of these flows that you're capturing might actually behind the scenes, like some of the metadata might be changing, and unless you're capturing it all, then you want to look into that. So yeah, cool. Looks like you put in a suggestion for how to deal with some of the garbage in it. So hopefully that might be helpful for people. All right, anything else? And I can show you. So this is that architect's guide I was talking about. Highly recommend it. It's really long. Deep, big read. See, I just copied it. See, look, they built my presentation for me. My takeaways, that snapshot, and they spend a lot of time. And I actually copied and pasted some of you guys may recognize this. I copied and pasted this into the chat a while back as well. So that's where all this data is. But they really get into, some detail, a lot of detail. So it's a big flow. They also talk about performance, like how to build your flows to avoid, the typical things as a developer we're familiar with, of like avoiding queries inside of loops and avoiding DML inside of loops. Flow's pretty good at bulkification as long as you don't put things inside of loops like that. So they have a pretty good read here and talk about how different DML can happen. So
awesome. Thank you, Daniel. That was mind-blowing, honestly. There was so much information, and it's really good to get a snapshot of everything's kind of coming together. They're coming up with so many options, and the flows are expanding so much. It's hard to pick what to go with. So so much.
Great.
Cool.
All
right, everyone, have a great night. Thank you for staying with us, and we'll share out the video and the slides. Daniel, also, if you want to send the slides to me for your presentation so I can share those out, we'll get that out to everyone. Thank you all. Have a great night.